In the last 24 hours, something happened in Ottawa that Washington did not expect, and the full consequences of that decision are only now beginning to surface. Canada just selected a Swedish radar system, the Saab GlobalEye, to become its primary airborne early warning platform. On paper, it sounds like a routine procurement decision. A government picked the technology it preferred. But that framing misses everything that actually matters here, because this was not just a contract. This was a signal. And the signal was directed not at Russia, not at China, but at the United States of America. This is Arctic Eye, where power shifts are decoded before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this. Because what you're about to hear is not speculation. It's already in motion. Let's be precise about what just happened. Canada operates within Norad, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, a joint military structure shared with the United States that has monitored the Arctic approaches since the Cold War. For decades, that surveillance network depended heavily on American-built systems, American radar architectures, American data links, American satellites providing the backbone of the picture. Canada contributed bases, geography, and personnel. America contributed the eyes and the nervous system. That arrangement, taken for granted for 70 years, just changed. Canada chose a platform built in Sweden over two American competitors. It rejected the Boeing E-7 Wedgetail, which is the primary airborne radar platform used by the United States Air Force. It rejected the L-3 Harris X. It chose GlobalEye, a Saab product mounted on the Bombardier Global 6000 aircraft, running a non-American radar architecture called the ER, an active electronically scanned array developed in Europe, owned by no American defense contractor, subject to no American export control decisions. And this changes everything, not because Sweden is hostile, not because GlobalEye is a bad platform. It is, in fact, extraordinary technology, but because the moment you introduce a non-American radar brain into a joint American-Canadian surveillance architecture, you have created a seam. And in military terms, a seam is not an inconvenience. A seam is a vulnerability. A seam is where the enemy looks for an opening. Military analysts are already warning that the interoperability question is not theoretical. It is structural, and it applies directly to Norad commitments. To understand why this matters so deeply, you need to understand what Norad actually does. Most people think Norad tracks missiles. That is true, but incomplete. Norad monitors everything that enters North American airspace from the north. Bombers, cruise missiles launched from submarines, hypersonic glide vehicles descending from above the pole, and in the future, increasingly sophisticated drones and unmanned platforms. The Arctic is the shortest path from Russian territory to American and Canadian cities. The polar route is not just a flight path, but it is the strategic highway of nuclear deterrence. Russia knows this. Russia has always known this. Russian long-range aviation, the Tu-95 Bear, the Tu-160 Blackjack, and increasingly the newer Tu-22M Backfire, has been probing Arctic airspace for decades. Not to attack, not yet. To test, to map the response times, to identify the gaps, to understand exactly how long it takes from the moment a bomber crosses a certain latitude to the moment an intercept aircraft is airborne. That measurement is everything in the first minutes of a real crisis. Right now, Canada's ability to feed information into that picture relies on a network of ground-based radars, the North Warning System, currently being upgraded, and the aging fleet of CP-14 Aurora Maritime Patrol aircraft. What Canada has not had until now is a modern, dedicated, airborne, early warning and control platform. That was the gap. GlobalEye was supposed to close the gap, and technically it might. But the question that no one in Ottawa is answering publicly is this: how exactly does the picture generated by a Swedish radar, processed by a Swedish mission system, get fused in real time with the American picture? Slash, slash. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is buried in the data architecture. It's been there from the beginning. Here is the technical reality that defense experts understand, but almost nobody talks about. Norad does not just collect radar contacts, it fuses them. It takes inputs from ground radars, space-based sensors, airborne platforms, and satellite intelligence, and it synthesizes a single, coherent air picture. That picture is distributed across American and Canadian command centers using a series of highly encrypted proprietary data links, Link 16, MADL, TTNT, and the classified backbone systems that govern how they talk to each other. Those systems were built by American defense companies under American military standards with American security architecture. GlobalEye runs on Saab's own mission management system. It is technically capable of using NATO standard data links. Link 16 compatibility is real, but compatibility and seamless integration are not the same thing. To truly fuse into the NORAD air picture, to become a node that feeds and receives from the joint picture without latency, without gaps, without the need for human translation at the seam. You need deep integration at the software level. And that integration requires American cooperation, American code, American approval. Washington controls the critical data link access. Even a fully non-American surface platform cannot replicate that access on its own. It has to be given. And here is where things get worse. The decision to buy GlobalEye was made without consulting the United States, in the way that previous joint capability decisions were consulted. The Americans knew a competition was happening. They did not know Canada was going to choose a non-American platform until the decision was announced. Think about what that means. The country that shares the northern surveillance architecture with you, the country whose cities are also protected by that architecture, just chose a foreign system without building your data link integration requirements into the contract specifications as a binding condition. That is not a minor administrative detail. That is a foundational question about whether the joint picture will actually work when it needs to work most. And this is where things get darker, because this decision did not happen in isolation. Canada is simultaneously negotiating a submarine contract with Germany, a deal worth roughly $60 billion for a fleet of Type 2 12CD submarines to patrol the Arctic underwater. Germany has pledged delivery around 2036. That is another non-American, non-domestic platform entering Canada's strategic force structure. Canada is also upgrading its fighter fleet with F-35s. Those are American. But the pattern is becoming visible. Canada is diversifying away from American defense dependency on multiple fronts simultaneously. Why? Intelligence reports suggest the answer is partly political, partly strategic, and partly a response to the shifting texture of the Canada-U.S. relationship under the weight of tariffs, diplomatic friction, and the broader uncertainty about American commitment to multilateral security structures. Canada is hedging. Canada is buying insurance. Canada is quietly constructing a defense posture that does not require absolute faith in Washington's reliability. And from Ottawa's perspective, given what the last several years looked like, that is a rational calculation. But rational calculations can still produce dangerous seams. And this is where the system failure possibility becomes real. //GlobalEye runs on a non-U.S radar architecture. If data links cannot be seamlessly fused with American Norad systems, there is a window where neither side is tracking Russian bombers over the pole. Let's walk through what that failure scenario actually looks like. Russia, and this is not speculation, Russian military planners have been doing this for decades, will watch this procurement decision closely. Russian military intelligence, the GRU, will track the integration timeline. They will watch for the moment between GlobalEye becoming operational in Canadian hands and the moment when its data is fully, reliably, seamlessly integrated into the NORAD common air picture. That transition window, Wichichiwi and Darcharinchiwi and Zaraporsti, Wichichiwi, which could be months, could be years, and Shir and Zur and Juri, is the most vulnerable period. Not because GlobalEye can't see Russian aircraft, it can, but because what GlobalEye sees might not be immediately visible to the American command centers that would order an intercept. Now, military analysts will tell you there are manual bridges, liaison officers, voice communication, but the entire logic of NORAD is built on automated, near instantaneous data fusion. The moment you introduce a manual bridge into a time-critical intercept chain, you've slowed it down. In peacetime, that delay is manageable. In a real crisis, in the 12 minutes between a submarine-launched cruise missile leaving the water and reaching a North American city, that delay is not manageable. It is catastrophic. And this is where the options analysis becomes painful, because there is no clean solution. Option 1. The United States accelerates data link integration with Saab system. That requires American engineers working inside a Swedish mission system. That requires sharing classified American network architecture with a foreign defense company. That is not something American military policy does easily or quickly. The timeline alone makes this option difficult. Procurement decisions move slowly. Integration programs move slower. Even if Washington agreed tomorrow to prioritize full GlobalEye NORAD fusion, you are looking at years of engineering, testing, and validation before the system is trusted enough to operate without a human in the loop at the data seam. And during those years, the window exists. Option 2. Canada agrees to operate GlobalEye under American network supervision, essentially allowing American systems to manage the data link output from a Canadian aircraft. That is technically feasible. It is politically radioactive in Ottawa, because the entire point of choosing a non-American platform was to reduce dependency on American systems. If GlobalEye ends up being managed by American data networks anyway, Canada has spent billions of dollars on sovereign capability that is not in practice sovereign. The Canadian government cannot sell that to its parliament. The military rationale collapses politically before it can be implemented. So that option is not really an option. Option 3. Canada and Saab develop a standalone Canadian data link, a domestic fusion layer that translates GlobalEye's output into a format NORAD can read without American technical assistance. That requires Canada to build sovereign network integration capability it does not currently possess. The cost is enormous. The timeline is longer than the option 1 timeline. And there is no guarantee that a domestically developed translation layer will meet the security standards required to plug into classified American command networks. Defense experts understand that this option is the most strategically coherent and the most technically ambitious. It would, if it succeeded, actually deliver the sovereign capability Canada says it wants. But succeeding is not guaranteed, and the seam remains open while Canada tries to get there. Option 4. Norad is restructured to formally accommodate multi-vendor, multinational platform architectures, essentially rewriting the integration standards so that future allied systems, whether Swedish, German, or Australian, can plug in without requiring American technical permission. NATO has been discussing something like this for years. It has not happened. The institutional inertia is massive. The security concerns are genuine, and every time a working group meets to discuss it, it gets deferred for another cycle. There is no good option. Every path forward involves accepting a risk that should not exist in a functioning alliance. And this is where the broader strategic picture begins to come into focus, because Russia is watching all of this. Russia has strategic intelligence analysts whose entire job is to map the gaps in the American-Canadian surveillance architecture. They know the North Warning System is aging. They know the GlobalEye is new. They know the integration timeline is uncertain. And Russian long-range aviation has been increasing its Arctic probing activity for the last 18 months. That is not a coincidence. Russian bomber patrols have become more frequent, more complex, and more deliberately designed to stress test response protocols. In the first quarter of 2026 alone, Arctic Security Monitoring Services recorded a significant increase in Russian patrol activity. Tu-95 and Tu-160 missions approaching the Alaskan and Canadian Arctic zones with shorter warning timelines than historical patterns suggested. That pattern is not random. It is calibrated. Russia is measuring. And what Russia is measuring right now is exactly how this GlobalEye procurement decision affects the response picture. Intelligence reports suggest Russian planners have already modeled the integration gap scenario. They are not planning an attack. They are filing away a contingency. And contingencies in the nuclear age are what deterrence is built on top of. The reality is that deterrence in the Arctic is not just about having weapons, it is about having eyes. The entire logic of mutual assured destruction depends on both sides believing that no first strike can be so complete, so fast, and so invisible that the other side cannot detect and respond. The moment a surveillance gap appears, even a theoretical one, even one that might be temporary, the calculus shifts. Not dramatically, not immediately, but it shifts. And the architects of Russian military strategy, people who have spent their careers studying exactly these kinds of asymmetric opportunities, notice when the calculus shifts. What this means is that Canada's procurement decision, made for entirely legitimate reasons, driven by real concerns about cost, capability, and strategic autonomy, has introduced uncertainty into a system that runs entirely on the elimination of uncertainty. NORAD's value is not just its capability. Its value is its credibility. Its value is that every adversary in the world believes it works, believes it is seamless, believes there are no gaps. The moment any doubt enters that picture, even procedural doubt, even bureaucratic doubt about data link integration timelines, the deterrent value of the entire architecture is fractionally diminished. And fractional diminishment, compounded over time, compounded across multiple procurement decisions, compounded across the submarine contract and the fighter fleet and the Arctic maritime strategy, is how great alliances develop structural vulnerabilities that no single decision was meant to create. Let's talk about what happens next, because this story is not finished. It is beginning. The Canadian government will now enter the integration planning phase with Saab and with Norad's joint command structure. That process will surface the exact questions we have been discussing. American military planners will push hard for binding integration commitments. Saab will attempt to demonstrate that GlobalEye's NATO standard data links are sufficient. Canadian defense officials will try to manage both relationships simultaneously. And somewhere in that bureaucratic process, a timeline will emerge, a date by which GlobalEye is supposed to be fully integrated into the Norad picture. That date will matter enormously, because Russian military planning does not wait for bureaucratic timelines to be met. Russian planning identifies windows and files them away. The question is not whether Russia would ever exploit a surveillance gap. The question is whether the gap closes before the geopolitical temperature rises to a level where exploiting it becomes an attractive option. And this is where things get worse, because the geopolitical temperature in the Arctic is already rising. It has been rising for 2 years. Russia's militarization of its Arctic territory has accelerated dramatically since 2022. New bases, new radar systems, new air defense networks across the Siberian and Kola Peninsula coastlines. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and is actively developing the capability to operate in polar regions. China and Russia are conducting joint naval exercises in the Bering Sea, directly between Russia's Pacific coast and Alaska. The strategic environment in which this GlobalEye decision was made is not the stable, predictable Arctic environment of 20 years ago. It is an Arctic that is contested, probed, and increasingly militarized on every side. Into that environment, Canada has introduced a non-American surveillance platform whose integration into the joint picture is theoretically possible, but practically uncertain. Military analysts are already warning that this timing, this precise combination of increased Arctic threat activity and a surveillance architecture in transition is the worst possible moment for an integration gap to appear. The system was stressed before this decision. This decision adds stress to a system that was already under pressure. Now let's talk about what Washington's response will be, because the American response to this decision has been notably quiet, and quiet in diplomatic terms is almost never a good sign. When allies make decisions that Washington disagrees with, there are two possible responses. There is the public response, statements of concern, diplomatic engagement, formal interoperability reviews. And then there is the quiet response, the adjustment of priorities, the reallocation of shared intelligence, the subtle recalibration of what gets shared and how quickly. American intelligence sharing within NORAD is not legally automatic. It is governed by agreements that can be tightened, reinterpreted, and modified. If American military planners decide that the GlobalEye integration uncertainty creates a security risk for American classified network architecture, a legitimate concern, they have both the legal authority and the institutional incentive to limit what gets passed through the integration seam while the integration is incomplete. That limitation protects American systems. It also degrades the Canadian picture. The truth is that no alliance operates purely on formal agreements. Alliances operate on trust, on alignment, on the daily practice of believing that your partner's decisions are compatible with your shared security. Canada just made a decision that raises a legitimate question about alignment. And America's quiet response to that decision will shape the next decade of North American defense architecture. Let's step back and look at what this means for the global picture, because this story is not just about Canada and the United States. It is about the future of Western defense architecture in an era where non-American technology is becoming genuinely competitive at the highest levels of military capability. Saab's GlobalEye is an exceptional platform. The Eye radar is world-class technology. European defense companies are producing surveillance, air defense, and naval systems that are credible alternatives to American products. That is new. It was not true 20 years ago. And as that capability gap closes, allies are going to face the same choice Canada just faced. Buy American, maintain seamless integration, accept dependency, or buy non-American, achieve some degree of strategic autonomy, and accept the integration uncertainty that comes with it. Canada chose autonomy. Australia is watching. The United Kingdom is watching. Every NATO member with a defense procurement decision in the next decade is watching how this integration challenge is managed. If it is managed well, if Canada and Saab and Norad find a genuine solution to the data link fusion problem, it establishes a precedent that non-American platforms can enter the joint alliance architecture without creating unacceptable gaps. That would be genuinely significant. That would mean the Western alliance could diversify its industrial base without sacrificing operational coherence. That is a good outcome, and it deserves to be acknowledged as a possibility. But if it is managed badly, if the integration timeline slips, if the data link seam proves harder to close than the procurement optimists predicted, if Russia's Arctic probe activity intensifies during the transition window, then Canada's decision will be studied for decades as an example of how a legitimate strategic choice was implemented at the wrong time, in the wrong way, without sufficient joint planning, and created a vulnerability that nobody intended, but everybody should have seen coming.